Time for all of us to change how we think about professional sports and decision making. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the Theory of Hockey show. I am your host, Nick Zararis. Get involved in the show community. The links are down in the show notes to subscribe to the Substack, the Discord server, and get involved as we make our way through and we figure out what you guys as an audience want and what you guys don't want. I'm going to take feedback. So if you want to get involved, if you want to make the show better, by all means, let me know in the comments. Let me know in the Discord server what you're thinking, what types of content you're looking for. And today's show is largely going to be viewed through the lens of the John Tortorella and Brad Treliving firings. Excuse me, the Bruce Cassidy firing, John Tortorella hiring, and Brad Treliving firing. I'm recording this on Monday evening. I was going to record it a little bit earlier, and then I saw Treliving got fired, so I had to recalibrate my notes to some degree. But as far as decision-making goes, as far as thinking goes, and gaming out how you as a hockey fan should process and think about these big-picture questions, I come at this from a historian background and from a political science background. I spent a lot of time in college in political science and history classes, and what the old people clichely tell you about college, about teaching you how to think about things, how to process information, it bears true. It gives you a frame of reference for understanding and dissecting considerations. And there are a lot of different ways. I now especially come at things from a long, medium, and short-term range of view at how a problem comes to a head. You don't have instances in life happen for any one reason. While an individual moment might happen because of a car accident or because of a death, that doesn't necessarily become the end game. You know, it took days, weeks, months for you to get to that point where you reach that boiling point. So I come at this thought, especially when it comes to Bruce Cassidy, who, by all accounts, is one of the 5 coaches in this league that matters. I am very down on the value of hockey coaches at the NHL level. I don't think there's a huge difference between the vast majority of guys. Now, we will talk a little bit later on about the merits and the value of guys like John Cooper, of guys like Bruce Cassidy, of Jared Bednar, and then we'll go to that next tier down, the Rod Brindamore class of guy who is consistently good in the regular season, but hasn't won that conference final, hasn't made it to a Stanley Cup final yet. And we can talk a little bit about Paul Maurice, who goes from being a pretty underwhelming coach in Winnipeg and a number of other stops to being a 2-time Stanley Cup champion and somebody who's viewed as one of the best coaches in the NHL. But to start out thinking about Bruce Cassidy in particular, I'm going to take you to a history class I took 8 years ago at this point, which is terrifying to say out loud. The idea of political continuation, meaning you might not think of, in this case, that class was about war. You might not think of war as a political mechanism, a decision-making tool, but in the context of how a politician operates, or the way a Congress in the United States is supposed to operate about voting to go to war as a decision-making process, it's the same deal here in sports. When we talk about making decisions from a stakeholder perspective, stakeholders, ownership, a president of hockey operations, a general manager, a head coach, people who have authority, people who have control over a situation, and how they choose to make their decisions impacts other parties because you have a certain amount of capital to make your decisions. When you're a general manager, you have a certain window of time to turn over the roster, to change your coaches, maybe change the way some of your hockey operations work if you don't have a president of hockey ops above you. Some teams have people in both capacities. The Rangers and the Devils both have Chris Drury and Tom Fitzgerald in dual roles where they are the GM and the president. We have seen teams operate with the general manager and president of hockey ops situation. The Maple Leafs very famously running the Kyle Dubas, Brendan Shanahan duo for a long time. We can debate whether or not Brendan Shanahan knifed Kyle Dubas a couple summers ago, and that's ultimately why Dubas opted to go to Pittsburgh. But when you are in one of these positions of authority, you have to make decisions not just based on your own interests, because that is the overarching number one. You know, if we're talking about a pyramid of needs, you know, from like a psychological background, you're looking at your own self-interest. You want to keep your job as long as possible to enact whatever vision you have for the team. That's your baseline. Then you need to appeal to your core constituencies. as a general manager, as a president of hockey ops, you're appealing upward. You think about the Tom Hanks speech in Saving Private Ryan, where you don't complain downward. You complain up the chain of command. If you are a general manager, a president of hockey ops, your goal, first and foremost, beyond your own self-interest, keeping your job, is keeping your owner happy. If you lose your ownership, you're done. There is no coming back from the owner deciding you're done. That's why I am generally a fan of having a president of hockey ops and general manager in a hierarchical situation, because I want a buffer between the two. I don't want the only hockey person my owner's talking to be my general manager, because the general manager has different considerations. The minute you overlap a general manager and a president of hockey ops in their responsibilities, that general manager has to consider the business side of things. They have to consider, well, if we decide to sell at the trade deadline, what is that going to do to our ticket sales? What is that going to do to our attendance, our concessions? And these are minute details in the grand scheme of what we're talking about here. This is not a business YouTube channel or podcast or show. This is a hockey show. And for me, I don't really care. Our goal here in trying to game these ideas out and answer these big questions, or at least push the conversation forward, is to make you reevaluate your frame of reference, or in some cases, your relationship with your favorite team. Because you look at how Vegas has operated, and I think Vegas has done a really good job over the years of being ahead of the curve, of moving away from players a year before they fall off, of moving away from players at opportunistic times when they have the chance to make their situation better. You think about how decision-making goes. So Vegas, in a very short period of time, has overhauled the vast majority of their roster. And this has always been a turbulent organization in that respect, where they have looked to improve their team by even the most modest of means. This is an organization that fired Pete DeBoer after making it to the conference finals a couple times, and they ultimately brought in Bruce Cassidy, who delivered that elusive Stanley Cup in their 8th season of existence, their 6th season of existence, 2022 to 3, 16, 17, 18, excuse me. Yeah. So about 6 years in, they win their first cup in their franchise's very young history, and Cassidy gets 3 more years. And the thing that's interesting to me, especially when we're talking about these stakeholder conversations, why is it Bruce Cassidy's fault that the Golden Knights goaltending situation is a mess? And they made their choice. They were this decision-making group, Kelly McCrimmon as the general manager, he is the one who made the decision. We are going with Adin Hill in the long term. We are going to trade Logan Thompson. Adin Hill had delivered a Stanley Cup. He was pretty good in that Stanley Cup run. He assumed the starter's role from Laurent Brossoit, who had been really solid up until getting injured at that point. A lot of how Vegas has operated the last handful of years has been comparable to what we would say we see in Toronto, what we see in Carolina, where we have individually talented goalies who are good. They're not terrible. I don't think Adin Hill is nearly as bad as he's played this year. You've seen Carolina with Freddie Anderson, now with Brandon Bussey. You saw Carolina previously with Antti Ranta. You've seen the Maple Leafs with Stolars, Wall, Jack Campbell, a litany of goalies where their goal is to play so well in front of that goalie, especially at even strength, that what they do is going to minimize the impact a goalie is going to have. If your goalie only has to make 23, 24 saves at even strength, most of the time that's going to be good enough. And Vegas, up until this year, has really done a strong job of building out that team in front of their goalie. I don't really have any qualms about the forward or the defensive groups in the macro, talent-wise, and talent's not the issue here. Are there guys who are underperforming, like Rasmus Anderson, who hasn't exactly fit in well since arriving from Calgary? Yeah. Do I think the Mitch Marner's transition has been as seamless as it could have been? No. I mean, there was not an expectation coming into this year that we would see Mitch Marner playing center for the Vegas Golden Knights, but out of necessity, because of injuries and because of performance, Bruce Cassidy was throwing things at the wall. And I start there about the idea of the decision-making, because let's say we get to the playoffs and the Golden Knights going into Monday night had 8 regular season games remaining to bring in John Tortorella. So almost assuredly going to qualify for the postseason. If they don't qualify for the postseason, where does the conversation shift? Number one, it goes to the goaltending. The goaltending has been awful this year. Aiden Hill has an .866 save percentage in 25 starts going into Monday night, and that's unacceptable. That is what you would expect from a career AHL goalie getting called up to the NHL in an emergency situation. And that's not a handful of starts. That's 25 starts. And he's been one of the 5 worst goalies in terms of goals saved above expected as well. I don't think this is a knee-jerk solution here. I don't think, and you see this in this league play out, where bad goaltending will sink you, even if the team in front of you is pretty good. And look, Edmonton did the grass is always greener trade earlier this year. Stuart Skinner has been a little cooler since the last few starts coming in as a Penguin, but he's been better than Tristan Jarry. I don't think that's much of a conversation at all. But the Oilers looked around at where they were at earlier this year and said, our present goaltending situation is absolutely outright untenable. We cannot continue moving forward with this group as constituted. They went out and they got Connor Ingram, who has usurped Tristan Jarry in net. But Vegas, we heard them in the rumor mill with goaltending. And the thing with goaltending, and this is an undercurrent of the macro conversation about stakeholders' decision-making, there aren't enough good goalies to go around. I think at this point in our collective understanding of hockey, we should all know there are not 32 good starting goalies. If anything, there are maybe 10. There are maybe 10 goalies across the entire league you feel reasonably good about year to year as being above average or better. You have your top of the league, Shesterkin, Hellebuck, Vasilevsky, Sorokin. Jake Onger's not having a particularly good year this year. He's somebody who has historically been okay. Swayman is doing better than last year, but not really at that elite threshold. Alex Lyon in Buffalo has done a nice job, but that's an example of how volatile this position is. Lyon was out there, but Lyon could have been had $2 million for the season in Buffalo. A number of teams across the league, including the Golden Knights, the Edmonton Oilers, could have greatly benefited from bringing Alex Lyon in. Now, you have no idea how well Alex Lyon would have played in your situation versus how he's played in Buffalo, but these are the types of considerations that, especially with hindsight, now that we are sifting through what is presumptive debris, Vegas, with John Tortorella, does not have a lot of opportunity here to change things. I think about it a lot and why coaches don't matter all that much. When it comes to systems and execution, hockey's more like soccer than it is like football. In soccer and hockey, if we're playing poorly, it's because we're not executing the system. It's not we need to change what we're doing to account for the others. No, we are not playing well because we are not executing the system as it's designed. We need to double, triple down on what we do and play it better. In football, if we're getting killed on the ground, we're going to take a defensive back off the field. We're going to put an extra linebacker on the field, and we're going to try and meet that problem in the A gap. We are going to try and solve our problem schematically. We are going to bring an extra defender. If we're getting killed in the seams, we're going to go to a cover 2 look and have that second safety high. We're going to flank out a nickel corner to try and take the seam. There are structural, mechanical ways we in football can attack these issues. In hockey, it's we're not playing good enough defense, so we need to reinforce our concepts, reinforce our principles, and get to work. We need to do our jobs. And I would not what you would call an expert when it comes to hockey tactics. I have a reasonable understanding of the principles of what each player is supposed to do in a given system, but you do not see system-wide change in season. You rarely see that in a playoff series. In a playoff series, especially where we're talking about 7 games, if there were ever a time to look at problem solving from a football-centric approach of we're getting killed doing this, let's change it, it would be in a best-of-7 playoff series where the turnaround is quick and you have to adapt, or the same team playing you every other day over the course of 2.5 weeks is going to continue to exploit those mechanical deficiencies. And that blame game, in effect, I don't think Kelly McCrimmon was going to really wear it for this year. If the Golden Knights go out in round 1, it happened 2 years ago. And 2 years ago, they went out in 7 in the first round to Dallas. And it happens when you are a good team and you get into the playoffs consistently. Sometimes weird things happen. Sometimes you're going to get in a best of 7 series where the final game is going to come down to a single goal. Maybe it goes to overtime. And that's the difference between going to round 2, round 3, the cup final, or winning the whole thing versus being on the outside looking in. And changing your coach in season is close to an object of last resort. And when we talk about stakeholders and decision making, you have constituencies to appeal to. We were talking before, general manager has to mostly placate up the food chain. The general manager usually gets 2 coaches. A GM usually gets 4.5 or 5 seasons. A head coach gets 2.5 seasons on the short end of the stick. That means you usually get, if you're a head coach, you get if you're a GM, you get 2 coaching hires to get it right. And then at that point, usually you don't get more than that unless, and there are exceptions. St. Louis, they had Doug Armstrong in that spot for a long time before they broke through. Dallas has not won a Stanley Cup with Jim Nill, but he's had that job for a long time. Cheveldayoff in Winnipeg has not broken through. In those smaller markets where it's expensive, teams don't have as much cash to pay away problems, to pay people not to work, it's a little bit of a harder sell. In a big market like Vegas, where they have been ruthless in their pursuit of roster improvement, I understand why they went this path. And it is always going to be easier to change one coach than it is several players. And from the Edmonton perspective, who we've talked about quite a bit because they've had similar goaltending issues, the conversation was loud about Chris Knoblauch at points this year. Going into that Olympic break, they ultimately went to a middle ground. They brought Paul Coffey back. Paul Coffey, who was a defensive assistant each of the last 2 years, was let go at the end of last season, retained in a consultancy role to the ownership group, ultimately comes back behind the bench and has been on the Oilers bench since the Olympic break ended. Those are the types of moves you have. You have only so many ways. And in that case, when we're talking about Paul Coffey, that's an example of a coach, Chris Knoblauch, recognizing this doesn't look good for me right now. They can get rid of me a lot easier than they can change the roster. And the weaknesses on Edmonton's roster are largely because of cap constraints. They can't get rid of Darnell Nurse and his $9.25 million because of his no trade protection. When you are limited in your moves, you are only incentivized further to change your general manager. And then when you're looking at it change your coach. And when you're Kelly McCrimmon and you're looking at this, I can understand it from a theory perspective. Let's say you ride out the rest of the year at Bruce Cassidy. You go to the playoffs, you're out in round 1 or round 2. If you were already leaning towards firing him, and the only justification you needed was getting eliminated from the playoffs before reaching a certain threshold, you are in effect giving John Tortorella, assuming he keeps the role through the postseason, the offseason, and into next year, you are giving John Tortorella runway to start what his tenure, his administration in Vegas is going to look like. Now, Vegas has run through Gerard Gallant, Pete DeBoer, now Bruce Cassidy. This is an organization that has very high expectations. John Tortorella, as a head coach, has not won a playoff series since 2019-2020 in the qualifying round when Columbus beat the Leafs. In the actual playoffs, he hasn't won a playoff series since 2018-2019 when his Blue Jackets upset the Lightning, the team that had Panarin, Matt Duchene, Sergei Bobrovsky before all of those guys moved on in free agency. Before that, John Tortorella hasn't won a playoff series since 2013 when he was the Rangers coach. You think about those stops where the Rangers, he comes into a team at the beginning of a window of contention. He takes over from Tom Renney, an old school guy. Tom Renney, who had connections to Glenn Sather, to Hockey Canada from the late 90s into the early 2000s. The Rangers really were at a crossroads point. And John Tortorella is not what I would call a developmental coach. He's not Marty St. Louis. He doesn't talk like Gene Hackman and Hoosiers. He's not building guys up. John Tortorella is of the Full Metal Jacket drill instructor mindset, where he is going to break you down into a moldable ball of clay, and then you'll do what he asks you to because you have lost all semblance of individuality and hope. That is why the Marine drill instructors act the way they do in real life and in the movies. They are trying to break you down, your sense of individualism, your sense of person, to make you moldable so you won't object, you will follow orders, and you will do what you are trained to do. That's the way John Tortorella coaches. His tenures increasingly burn out faster. His gimmick is effective in short bursts. The Flyers 2 years ago, they were a really nice story 2 years ago where they were playing for their lives into a playoff spot through early March and really had a chance to break through. Maybe if the Flyers make the playoffs 2 years ago, he is still in that capacity right now. But Torts is not somebody I envision in Vegas for the long haul. He's been an NHL head coach for 23 seasons. I think if anything, and I talked about this the other day with somebody when I was putting together my notes for Locked On Oilers, John Tortorella is a really good proxy for fans and for people higher up the food chain to get some of their anger out. I do think on some level there is a Schadenfreude element to watching John Tortorella voraciously berate guys you feel are underperforming or are disappointing you. Is that the healthiest way to look at the coach-player relationship? No. But I do think there is a certain element of sadism, of masochism to the way people look at underperforming athletes. And Torts is not going to break through with Vegas. I feel very confident in saying John Tortorella is not leading the Golden Knights to a Stanley Cup this year. John Tortorella hasn't made a Stanley Cup final in 22 years. This is somebody who is at the tail end of his hockey life. And this is somebody who has had a ton of opportunities in a lot of different environments and a lot of different markets. Vegas has been as cutthroat as it gets as an organization in striving for improvement. And nothing about John Tortorella's preferred style, and he on Monday said, I'm not going to change that much because I don't have that much time. He really is here just to be a different voice. And when you look at the numbers for the interim coach thing, there are legs to it. Interim coaches, on occasion, do magical things. Earlier this year, the Blue Jackets, they fired Dean Evason. They are in dead last in the Eastern Conference. They're 19-19-7. With Rick Bowness as head coach, they've gone 19-5-5. Columbus is in a playoff spot as of the time of this recording. Truly great turnaround. And a byproduct of slightly better defense, the goaltending getting a little bit better. Jet Greaves has been really impressive for them. The Kings made a coaching change earlier this year. They fired Jim Hiller. They promoted DJ Smith internally. The Kings without Kevin Fiala, are really missing at least one more piece. They would need to have made a run. The Kings are hanging around, but their math is almost untenably impossible at this point. The Blues last year, they fire Bannister. They bring in Jim Montgomery. They're the best team in the NHL post the Four Nations face-off break. They go 35-18-7 with Jim Montgomery. And they go on a really nice run. They arguably could have beat Winnipeg in that first-round playoff series and very well may have. The Blues did it the year before where they fired Craig Berube in season. They promote Bannister, who goes 30-19-5. 2 years ago, the Kings, they fire Todd McClellan. They hire and promote Jim Hiller internally. Hiller goes 21-12-1. 2 years ago, the Wild, out of nowhere, fired Dean Evason 19 games into the season. John Hines goes 34-24-5. The biggest one on this list, Jay Woodcroft, 3-9-1 out of the gate. The Oilers, they start the year abroad in one of those international games. They come back. Guys are injured. They're getting league worst goaltending. They pull the trigger. They go and poach Chris Knobloch from the Rangers AHL affiliate. Knobloch goes 46-18-5. The Oilers make the Stanley Cup final. 3 years ago, Lane Lambert, the Islanders fire him in December. They hire Patrick Waugh, who goes 20-12-5. They made the playoffs that year. The Islanders are almost certainly going to make the playoffs this year. 4 years ago now, Dominic Ducharme, 8-30-7, brutal. They hire Marty St. Louis, 14-19-4. That more towards a transition period and rebuilding as opposed to trying to win right away. And then if you're a Golden Knights person, the Devils in 2000, they fire Fortek, who's 41-28-5. Yes, there are ties in that record for Larry Robinson, the Hockey Hall of Famer, one of the best to ever do it, who goes 4-4 at the end of the regular season. And those Devils go on to win the Stanley Cup with 8 regular season games remaining, firing their head coach. The Golden Knights firing John Tortorella is extremely rare. Firing Bruce Cassidy this late in the season for John Tortorella, it is extremely rare. This is uncommon. You do not see teams do this. Now, some of that is based on tradition. Some of that is based on best practices where you want to give a guy a chance to get himself situated, to think about his next job. Generally speaking, at this point in the season, there's not really anybody out there in the interim coaching market that you're going to be so enticed to pull the trigger on. If this were February and you wanted to entertain the idea of a second Pete DeBoer stint, that you would have a better chance of convincing me on than this John Tortorella experience working. And I said it before, general managers usually get about 5 years to figure their plan out. They get 2 head coaches. Coaches get 2 seasons. Usually by midway through that second season, it falls apart and they get canned at the end of the year, or they break through and they become a longer tenure GM. I mean, Andrew Burnett, who's been in Nashville a very short period of time, is already the 7th most tenured coach in this league. You look around at the landscape and the turnover, and I worked out the math. The average team in the NHL has missed the playoffs for 2 years. 2 years is what you are afforded when you inherit a team that has not made the playoffs. And that blessing of time is both good and bad, because the longer it takes for you to start building momentum, to start making progress, the less likely it is that that good outcome is going to come. And before I was saying, I just don't think there are a lot of impactful coaches in the NHL. And I think the turnover and the frequency in which we see the carousel work tells you that. Think about all the guys I said before on that interim list, where Dean Evison got fired a couple years ago from Minnesota. He's in Columbus. You think about Dean Evison before that, getting fired on another state and taking the Minnesota job. You look around, you think about the Kings, who went from Jim Hiller to DJ Smith and had Todd McClellan there. When you are one of these teams that is constantly on the merry-go-round of, well, this guy isn't it, we got to go to the next one, that's the right outcome. You don't want to give guys more time than they deserve because your players are not getting any younger. And sometimes that new coach bump yields great results, like Jim Montgomery in St. Louis last year, where the Blues were one of the best teams in the NHL post the Four Nations face-off break. And that's really the cutthroat nature of this sport. And we're talking about short periods of time. 5 years for a GM, you get 2 coaches. In those 5 years, you need to show something. Chris Drury is at the 5-year mark in New York. Tom Fitzgerald, I believe, is at the 6-year mark. All of that is to say, once you reach that 4 or 5-year mark, it becomes really challenging to get your feet back under you, because at that point, you've had 3, 4, 5 drafts. You've probably turned over close to half of the roster you inherited. You've gone through multiple coaches. You are out of cards to play. And then if you're a general manager and you have not made it to the mountaintop after 5 years, you need to hope you can convince your owner that you should be able to rebuild the team. Your hope at that point is, I can tell my owner, well, we have these good players that I got. We're going to turn them into younger players and draft picks, and we're going to miss the playoffs for a year or two, but that's going to buy us 5 years, 2 years from now. And you look at the state of the Devils, the Rangers, the Maple Leafs, all teams who have massively underperformed their expectations this year. The Maple Leafs, they fired Brad Treliving. We have heard varying degrees of safety for Tom Fitzgerald in New Jersey. Fitzgerald very well may either get promoted to president of hockey ops and a general manager brought in. Maybe they fire Fitzgerald outright and bring in 2 new people for each role. We've not heard anything as far as Chris Drury goes. We are operating under the assumption that Chris Drury is safe for at least 1 more year in New York, even though he has missed the playoffs 2 straight years and spent at top of market trying to improve the roster to win right now. But in Vegas, with Kelly McCrimmon, who has been as assertive and direct as possible in the trades he's executed to win, and they've won already. If Vegas wanted to coast on that one cup and try and orient a team for maybe a year or 2 from now around Eichel, around Hannafin, Anderson, the slightly younger pieces. Stone's getting up there as far as Stone's still a good player, don't get me wrong, but he is getting older. They just gave Mitch Marner that big contract in the offseason to try and get that group that extra scoring punch. Vegas has had a hard time scoring in the postseason the last couple of years. That's a downstream effect of Bruce Cassidy hockey, where Bruce's teams play really good through the middle defensively. They are excellent at taking away shooting lanes and forcing you into lower quality chances you don't really want to live on. And those teams have had hard time scoring because they don't have as much of an offensive bend in what they do and going from defense to offense. This is really going to be a fascinating case study in what the new voice can do. Now, I am always of the opinion you got to be trying to get better. Anytime you are content, even if you win the Stanley Cup, you are leaving meat on the bone because your contemporaries are getting better. Everyone around you is constantly trying to get better. And teams that are only comparing against themselves as far as improvement goes, they are the teams that get left behind. It's one thing to say this guy isn't as good as we need to do better. Well, is the new guy we're going to get good enough to make the teams we're in competition with? No, then we don't want him. And that's the challenge for these teams now, like Boston, like the Rangers, the Devils, who are all underachieving simultaneously. Now, the Devils, their core, Hughes, Hischier, Bratt, a little bit on the younger end comparison to the Rangers and the Leafs, where Matthews and Nylander towards the end of their 20s, the Rangers, Zibanejad, Miller, Trocheck, all over the age of 30. And it leaves you short on doors. And so I'm Mike Sullivan. If this were year 3 of Mike Sullivan, he would get fired for this, but it's year 1. The Rangers are paying him a ton of money. He's the highest paid coach in the league. He's going to get a mulligan. And when you're in your decision-making as general manager, you do need your coach to be in alignment with you. This creates the downstream effect we talk about. I go back to a lot. Well, I know there are conflicting opinions about Moneyball, the movie, what the impact of it has been on sports discourse and the proliferation of Michael Lewis's book and the widespread adoption of analytics. The interplay between the factions of the Scouts, of Billy Beane and Peter Brand, of Art Howe, the A's manager, and then the players all being willing to embrace their new roles in the pecking order that Beane is trying to establish, I think it's really instructive for how you need to think about your teams. Because just because Kelly McCrimmon fired Bruce Cassidy, well, now he needs John Tortorella to enact some type of changes to coax better play, even if that's just a different way of communicating, if that's a different way of assembling the lineup, of playing different players with who. He needs something different here to jumpstart what has been a disappointing season. If you're John Tortorella and you're coming into a brand new environment, I haven't looked off the top of my head if he has coached anybody on this team at any point at any of his previous stops. I know he has Olympic connections to some of the Team USA guys like Jack Eichel, but for the most part, Tortorella is coming in here blind. For the most part, Tortorella is coming in here with limited constituency appeal where you don't really know what the players' opinions of him are. He's going to need to, on some level, try and win those guys over so that they can trust his decision-making, because that's an integral part of this process. You think about what makes John Cooper so special as the coach of the Lightning. You heard what Connor McDavid said about him a couple of weeks ago after the Oilers lost to the Lightning. John Cooper has unquestioned support and buy-in from the guys on his team. You think about how, at points, when John Cooper has felt the need, he has benched guys like Nikita Kucherov, like Braden Point, and said, that's not good enough. I need more from you. And do you hear complaining? Do you hear back channeling? No. Those guys have such an unequivocal level of buy-in for what John Cooper wants to do philosophically. There isn't a question. There isn't a back and forth. It's Coop says I need to be better. I need to be better. And you compare that to some of the coaches you see that are kind of flailing. Speaking from the Rangers' perspective, you've watched the way Mike Sullivan has talked around Connor Sheary and JT Miller being terrible hockey players at points this year, and at points complained about Alexis Lafreniere, about Scott Morrow, and it really becomes a challenge because when you are that coach and you have your constituencies, you need to play the roster the way the general manager assembled it. That's why I brought up Moneyball. That's one of the main points of conflict there, where Art Howe doesn't want to play Scott Hatteberg at first base because he wants to play Carlos Pena. He wants to use Mike McNaughty as opposed to Chad Bradford. These are the types of questions you need to be able to ask yourself, because if you're a general manager and your coach isn't deploying the lineup the way you want to, if you're a coach or a manager and you're not playing the lineup the way the guy above you wants to, they will get rid of you to get the lineup played the way they want to, or they will trade pieces away that you are using. So you can't play a lineup dissimilar from what they want. And I am very curious to see how Vegas goes about making this work. Tortorella himself has said, like I said before, he can't change that much. He only has 3 weeks to go in the regular season. We're talking the 17th or 18th of April, the last day of the regular season for most teams across the league. How do you enact widespread change? You don't. You need better execution. You need to make Aiden Hill's life as simple as possible. And if he's not good enough, you go to Akira Schmidt. You go to whatever goalie in your mix that you can play, being cap compliant, and you ride it to the best of your ability. We have seen backup goalies or fringe starter goalies like Jordan Binnington, like Aiden Hill, like Cam Ward, play all the way through to a Stanley Cup. I don't think Vegas has the goods this year as far as the composition of their roster. They're probably a little too top heavy. Their team defense, even though it's great underlying numbers wise, giving up the fewest scoring chances against over the last months, top 5 in expected goals for and high danger chances for, top 5 special teams units, power play and penalty kill. This is a team that on paper is very close, but the execution hasn't been there. And that's where the new voice bump is supposed to come in and kick this group into gear. And I really find it interesting to talk about from this philosophical and as political maneuvering as opposed to an executive decision, because it is a political maneuver. This is Kelly McCrimmon's way of saying, I've identified a problem. This is my solution. Now, if this doesn't work, that's another strike against Kelly McCrimmon. If it does work, this buys him more time down the road to try and figure out the roster and try and figure out who the next coach after John Tortorella is. We have seen Vegas only go to the proven, established veteran head coach coffer, and it has yielded pretty good results. The Golden Knights have been veteran-laden, older, expensive teams, and that's generally what you see in the types of coaches they bring in. I don't think we're going to see Vegas really embrace a full-scale rebuild until they have to. You know, there will come a point where they can't keep kicking that can down the road. They have 2 drafted players in their lineup. Pavel Dorofeev has been an incredible find for them over the last 2 years, but beyond that, they don't have a lot here. They traded Zach Whitecloud, who has been better in Calgary than Rasmus Andersson has been in Vegas, which I think is a big cause for concern. We'll see. The assumption has been Andersson was traded to Vegas because that was the only team he was willing to sign an extension with, but we'll see how that goes. But you got to think about these bigger picture questions, not just in terms of hockey, because these are decision makers trying to buy time. And the more aggressive you are, the harder it is to sustain that over an extended period of time. If you fire 5 coaches in 5 years, not a lot of owners are going to have trust in your decision making. I marvel at the guys who are able to sustain for an extremely long period of time, especially when you don't win. You know, Kevin Cheveldayoff benefits from Winnipeg not being a cash flush ownership group who will pay people to go away or to not work. I think that's an organization that is unequivocally at a crossroads that needs a new voice in there at the top. The Rangers unequivocally, the Devils unequivocally, the Maple Leafs we saw. They fired Brad Treliving. Brad's decisions over the last 2 years, nothing short of disastrous in the types of players he brought in, the results they've produced, what it has done to morale, the unwillingness to fire Craig Berube in season this year, even though Berube has worn thin on that group. And again, Berube, much like Tortorella, is of that voracious, aggressive coaching style, which works good for some guys and doesn't for others. I think, and on that note, I'll wrap up on this thought because we don't know what makes a good NHL coach. This is not like football. If I put Kyle Shanahan on any of the other 31 teams, within 2 or 3 years, he'll have an offense he likes personnel-wise, and they'll be good enough to make the playoffs. You look at guys like that. You look at Mike McDonald in Seattle. You look at his brother Jim in San Diego. When you are a good football coach, you can bring your scheme and your ideas from place to place and get execution. In hockey, it's so much less about scheme than it is your capacity to manage people, to build trust, and build credibility up the food chain. Get your GM in your corner, be in total alignment with him so that if he needs to buy you time, he can. I don't see that happening here in Vegas. I think Toronto, they will absolutely change coaches. They will bring in a transition period where the Leafs are probably going to take it on the chin next year. They missed the playoffs this year. They probably miss the playoffs next year because they need such an infusion of talent. The Devils and the Rangers, They are one off season away from being right back in the mix, respectively, but I think the Devils have a better chance of that than the Rangers do because Jack Hughes is a Hart Trophy caliber player when he's healthy. I think teams like Seattle, teams like the Kings that have been on this treadmill of we're close, but we're not close, but we think we can make the playoffs, but we don't really have cup aspirations. I mean, the Kings haven't won a playoff series since they won the Stanley Cup 12 years ago. And that organization doesn't get the same heat that other teams do because the Kings are pretty low in the LA sports pecking order. When you have the Dodgers as the unequivocal best team in baseball, the Lakers, who are the league's preeminent franchise with LeBron and Luka, it's hard for me to envision widespread upswell against the Kings ownership group doing a bad job. And you got 2 cups in the not so distant past. But I find coaching in hockey so interesting because it is so different than the other sports. Because I think about John Cooper and his tenure. He's been in Tampa Bay an extremely long time now. We're talking more than a decade as coach, has been through some really tough stints, man. You think about where they were at in 2015. They take a step back a little bit there in that window. They make that Drouin for Sergachev trade. They come back. They trade for JT Miller and Ryan McDonough. They go out in round 1 to Columbus. They take it on the chin. At that point, very well could have been within reason for John Cooper to get fired. But based on the credibility he had established over the previous several years, he was able to ride that out. And they come back the next year. They win the cup. They win the cup the year after that, too. They go back to back. Now John Cooper's bulletproof. He has that job as long as he would like to have it. You look at Paul Maurice, who I was done with. Paul Maurice is under 500 when you go and look at what his tenure is all time. Paul Maurice has a really ugly record when we're talking about just wins and losses here. I got it in my notes. 1 second. Excuse me. Because I'm all over the place in my notes here because I use the same notepad for everything, which is not the best. But okay. John Cooper all time is 617, 324, 327, and 89. He's got a 640 points percentage. He's made 4 cup finals. He's won 2. He's got an Olympic silver medal. Paul Maurice, 951 and 801, 99 ties, and 151 overtime losses. He's under 500 for his career, but he's got the 2 cups, and he is now bulletproof in Florida. He will have that job as long as he would like. Jared Bednar, 438, 260, and 74. Other coaches, I think, that are worthy of mention in this conversation as being coaches who might matter. Marty St. Louis, we'll see if Montreal can get out of this, wow, that's a fun story stage, to, okay, this team is ready to contend right now. Rod Brindamore, great regular season coach. Need to see him win at conference finals, make a cup final. Need to see him get to that highest threshold. I want no part of Joe Quenneville. I am uninterested. The off-the-ice stuff, I'm good. He might be one of the best coaches of all time. I have no interest in having him. Mike Sullivan, he won the gold medal with Team USA this past February. He's got the 2 cups from his time in Pittsburgh. He's got a nice resume. I have been underwhelmed with his decisions with the Rangers this year, especially now that they are firmly out of the playoff race. They're still not giving Scott Morrow a lot of run. They are really caught up in the Connor Sheary of it all, which, isn't a great look for Sullivan because that's a family member. It's a nephew-in-law or a son-in-law or something like that, which just doesn't look good on a bad team to not be playing young guys. I mean, there's a reason Connor Sheary was in the AHL last year. I think anybody who has watched the Rangers to some extent this year would be confused as to why Connor Sheary has gotten so much work in the top 6. But that will do it for this edition of the Theory of Hockey show. I will be back later in the week. Haven't decided yet what the content menu is going to look like beyond these long-form conversation episodes. But be back later in the week. Keep checking out the shorts, which are doing well. Join the conversations. Get involved. The Discord, the Substack, all of that and more down in the show notes. I will talk to you guys real soon. Everyone enjoy the hockey. And selfishly, I'm a little happy Torts is back because anytime Torts is giving it back to the media, I can't help but laugh.